To understand the 20th century, we need to look at the events that shaped them, and one of these was the rise of communism and socialism in Europe. We need to ask ourselves why ideologies such as these were able to rise in the first place. Well, throughout majority of human history, people lived within a social hierarchy, which means there are different classes within societies which all hold different amounts of power. The most common among these were a monarchy, which people lived under for hundreds of years. But it wasn't until the American and French Revolution where people started to question the institution of a monarchy as a style of government in an organized manner. Famous writers such as John Locke openly was against absolute monarchy. He argued that people have natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property. If a ruler violates these rights, citizens have the right to revolt. These types of intellectual topics became more important and talked about by the Industrial Revolution. When humans discovered the power of machines and how they could be used, then everything started to move much quicker. Because the Industrial Revolution allowed a new wealthy middle class of factory owners and merchants. Before this, political power was mostly held by kings and aristocrats. Industrialization made non-nobles economically powerful. While some people became extremely wealthy, many workers lived in poor conditions, worked long hours, and had low wages. This created new social tensions between workers and industrial elites. Later, in the 1800s, more radical theories emerged from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In their book, The Communist Manifesto, they argued that for all of human history, war and struggle has been a class struggle. Industrial society created two main classes, the bourgeoisie, which were the factory owners, and the proletariat, which were workers. Marx wrote that communists would openly support and overthrow the existing social order. That way, they could start from scratch. These ideas spread across Europe during the late 1800s as industrialization grew. Inspired by socialist ideas, workers began forming labor unions, socialist political parties, and workers' organizations. For example, one of these groups would be called the Second International, which was founded in 1889. It brought together socialist parties from many different countries into one big group. This group had many members and were trying to spread socialism everywhere. Many countries often rejected the ideas, but it was in Tsarist Russia where they would find the most success. Russia in the late 1800s was very different from industrial countries like Germany or Britain. It was ruled by a monarchy under Nicholas II. Most people were peasants, not factory workers, and political opposition was suppressed. Marxist ideas spread among intellectuals and underground political groups. One major Marxist organization formed was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in March 1898. This party was mainly led by Lenin, Martov, and Plekhanov. They would later all split into different factions in 1903, at the Second Congress, where Lenin and Martov had different methods of achieving their goal. Furthermore, they also had different opinions on party membership. Lenin wanted someone who recognizes the party's program and supports it by material means and by personal participation, whereas Martov just wanted someone's support. They didn't need to give money or any materials to the party. Plekhanov is often called the father of Russian Marxism and supported Lenin during this debate, which helped Lenin win the vote. To understand how any of this is even possible was due to the massive amounts of investment they were getting from different organizations. A major investor was the General Jewish Labor Bund, which sponsored the party's first Congress. They would end up giving around 30 to 40,000 rubles per year to the party in the early 1900s. Some other ways the party would gain money was by organizing armed robberies, racketeering, and other criminal activities to finance the party's operations. After the split occurred, the parties went into two different factions, one called the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, the other called the Mensheviks, led by Martov. Both would work together when it came to strikes and protests against the Tsar, but they would later argue about the method to achieve their goal. In 1905, something major happened. Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War, which angered both soldiers and civilians. This was perfect for Lenin and Martov. They could use this to spread more anti-Tsar propaganda. As people became more upset, in late 1904, the dismissal of 4 union members at a major factory sparked citywide strikes involving over 100,000 workers. This, alongside the defeat against Japan, did not make the Tsar look good. But things were only going to get worse. On January 22nd, Father Georgy Gapon, who was a priest, worked with lower classes in the Russian cities. He organized a peaceful march to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. The petition requested basic reforms, including an 8-hour workday, the right to strike, and the creation of a democratically elected constitutional assembly. The guards were nervous and poorly trained for crowd control. The guards would end up firing on the crowd. 200 to 1,000 people would end up dying in this massacre. Unfortunately, this march was useless, because even if they were allowed into the palace, which wasn't allowed by law, they would have no one to talk to, because the Tsar wasn't even there. The Tsar had left St. Petersburg on Saturday, January 21st, for his residency at Tsarskoye Selo, located approximately 15 to 25 miles south of the capital. Since he was away from the city, Nicholas II was not fully informed of the situation as it developed in St. Petersburg on Sunday morning. But regardless, it hurt his image, which gave more fuel to the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Uprisings and strikes started to happen. In order to fix this, the Tsar promised some reforms, like the creation of the Duma, which was the parliament, and basic civil liberties like freedom of speech and assembly. This temporarily calmed the situation, but did not satisfy radicals who wanted ultimate power. After the split in the 1905 revolution, the party became more fractionalized and secretive. Members were actively organizing workers, spreading propaganda, and planning revolutionary activity. With the Bolsheviks focusing on discipline and professionalism, and Mensheviks on border support and democratic participation, after the Bloody Sunday massacre, the Tsar tried to balance reform and repression, but it never satisfied anyone. Liberal reformers, socialist groups, and anarchists were all pushing for change. Local governments were weak in many regions, so unrest and violence flared up in towns and countryside. And then came the year 1914, which would be the nail in the coffin for the Tsar, because the nation was already unstable and breaking apart, and by getting involved in a foreign conflict would make the political climate even worse. But this was great for the Bolsheviks, because they used this war as an opportunity to gain influence and prepare for a revolution. The First World War caused massive hardships, food shortages, inflation, and high casualties in the army. The Bolsheviks used these problems to gain support among the workers, peasants, and soldiers. They distributed leaflets, newspapers, and propaganda urging soldiers to turn against the Tsar and the war. During this time, key leaders like Lenin, Trotsky, and Zinoviev built strong underground networks to organize a total revolution. When Lenin returned to Russia in 1917, he immediately pushed the Bolsheviks toward seizing power, famously with this slogan, quote, "Peace, land, and bread," end quote. Since the government was weak and people were looking for a solution, this slogan seemed pretty good. The Tsar would end up abdicating and a provisional government was set up, mostly liberal politicians, but it continued the war and failed to address land reforms. In October, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government in what is often called the Bolshevik coup. They seized power in Petrograd with minimal bloodshed. Lenin and the Central Committee took control of the government, with Trotsky organizing the takeover. The Bolsheviks signed a peace deal with Germany to end World War I for Russia. When the Civil War broke out, food shortages, economic collapse, and widespread unrest made the population easy to control through fear. The Bolsheviks wanted to eliminate rivals and present counter-revolutions, using terror as a tool of political control. In order to do this, they created the Cheka, which was the secret police, and they were used to put down any sort of resistance. The man who was in charge of this organization was Felix Dzerzhinsky. He organized systematic suppression of political enemies and oversaw mass executions, arrests, and forced labor camps. Lenin approved and encouraged the use of terror as a political tool. He believed extreme measures were necessary to defend the revolution. An example of this would be the murder of the Romanov family when the Tsar abdicated his throne. Him and his family went to live past the Ural Mountains in July 1918. Bolshevik authorities, such as Philip Golashtokin, he communicated with Moscow about what to do with the Tsar. Philip was a senior Bolshevik party official and commissar of the Ural Regional Soviet. In practice, Philip was one of the most powerful Bolshevik leaders in the Ural region. He was sent to Moscow to discuss the fate of the Romanovs. He got orders from Yakov Serladev, another senior party member, to execute the family. He ordered their execution as anti-Bolshevik forces approached the city. This killing was led by Yakov Yarovsky. He was appointed head of security at the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. He planned their killings by selecting guards and arranging the basement where it would occur. Guards took the family to a basement and executed them. Yakov himself shot the Tsar, and the rest of the family were killed by the guards. After the killing, Yakov directed the transport of the bodies into the forest outside. He supervised attempts to hide and destroy the remainings using acid, burning, and burial in secret graves. This sent shockwaves throughout the world. They were murdered for no good reason other than the Bolsheviks didn't like them. In Bolshevik-controlled zones, people who were religious were most of the time accused of working with anti-revolutionary forces. While there was no evidence for the support of the white forces, they were still executed for the fact that they were religious, because religion represented the old order of the Tsar. There are estimates that hundreds to several thousand clergy members were killed during the Civil War years, so the exact numbers are debated. If we look at a map, we can see the important cities and control of factories. Since the Bolsheviks controlled major cities like Moscow and Petrograd, this gave them the boost of major railway hubs, which made transporting supplies and troops much easier. The Bolsheviks had a central leadership structure under Lenin and Trotsky. Trotsky built and organized the Red Army, which became disciplined and coordinated. In contrast, the white forces were divided. White army leaders or commanders such as Alexander Kolchak, Anton Denikin, and Pyotr Wrangel. They often disagreed and operated separately, which made coordination difficult. Organizations like the Cheka helped the Bolsheviks suppress uprisings and opposition inside their territory. This helped them maintain control of key regions while fighting the war. Their use of propaganda made people afraid to rebel or disobey, because everything was controlled by the government, which meant if they didn't follow along, they could be starved to death, which we will see later, or killed in some other way, because most of the executions were done without any trials. Before the revolution, much of the farmland in Russia was owned by wealthy landowners and nobles. These estates were usually professionally managed, equipped with tools and livestock. They were worked by experienced laborers. After the revolution, peasants seized or were given this land, breaking large estates into many small farms. Some of the people who received land had previously been factory workers or laborers, or had worked only as seasonal farmhands, and had never managed to farm themselves. Running a farm isn't easy and required knowledge about crop rotations, soil management, and planting schedules. Without this knowledge, most farms did not make enough food. During the Civil War, the Bolshevik government introduced something called war communism. Under this policy, the government seized grain from peasants to feed cities and the Red Army. Peasants sometimes reduced production because they knew the state would take their crops. This led to food shortages and economic collapse in some areas. Because of these policies, people who were not meant to manage farms ended up making things worse. Agriculture production dropped sharply, which led to the Russian famine of 1921, in which millions of people died from hunger and diseases. One of the battles that decided the fate of Russia was in 1919. Anti-Bolshevik white movement came very close to winning. One of the leaders, Anton Denikin, launched a major strategic offensive called the Moscow Directive. His White Army launched an offensive from southern Russia and pushed north towards Moscow, which was the capital controlled by the Bolsheviks, near the city of Orel. The Red Army launched a major counterattack. The army was organized by Leon Trotsky. By late 1919, Denikin's troops captured several cities and were only about 300 kilometers from Moscow. If they had taken the city, the Bolshevik government might have collapsed, but Bolshevik forces stopped Denikin's advance. Several major problems caused a white defeat. As Denikin advanced north, his army moved hundreds of kilometers away from supply bases. This caused food shortages, lack of ammunition, and difficulty moving reinforcements. The Red Army, by contrast, was fighting closer to its main industrial centers, making supplies easier to reach. The Bolsheviks controlled western Russia and could mobilize far more soldiers. When the counterattack began, the Red Army outnumbered the white forces. Denikin's soldiers had been fighting continuously for months. When the Red Army counterattacked, many white units collapsed quickly. After losing the battle, Denikin's army retreated south rapidly. The Red Army recaptured lost territory, and the White Southern Front began to collapse. In 1920, Denikin resigned due to the loss and lack of trust among the officers. He left Russia and went into exile in France, and was replaced by Pyotr Wrangel. But by then, the strategic situation had already turned in the favor of the Bolsheviks, and there wasn't much that the Whites could do. But this wasn't the last battle of the war. It was a nail in the coffin. The last battle will occur in Crimea. The Red Army attacked the defensive lines protecting Crimea. After losing, Wrangler evacuated about 150,000 soldiers and civilians by ship. The organized white armies inside Russia ceased to exist. This effectively ended the civil war in European Russia. This basically was a short summary and explains how the Bolshevik came to power and what made this possible in the first place. Russia was a special place for an ideology like this to take effect, because there were many other revolutions that happened in Europe but ultimately failed, which I will get into later. But when the revolution happened in Russia, it was not by accident. There were people and organizations that planned and funded this ideology to work. Once communism found a home in Russia, it became a place to spread communism across the globe. Even their flag represents this idea, an image of the world painted in red with a hammer and sickle on top of it. Once the dust settled, things quickly started to change. For example, the utopia which the Bolsheviks had promised quickly became a dystopia, in which the worship of religion was replaced with the worship of the state. An example of this was cultural propaganda, because once the Civil War was over, there was still a large part of the population that still held on to old ideas like religion and tradition, and these people needed to change. They started small, like changing the names of cities. For example, Petrograd was changed to Leningrad. That way, when people would mention the city, they would think of the revolution instead of the old order. Art was also changed. The Bolsheviks believed art should serve the revolution. Early revolutionary artists supported the government, including Vladimir Mayakovsky and Sergei Eisenstein. They created posters encouraging workers to support socialism and films glorifying revolution and class struggle. And the media was also treated this way. Newspapers like the Pravda supported official ideology. Traveling propaganda trains carried speakers, films, and pamphlets across Soviet Russia, and factories held mandatory political meetings. This was done to millions of people. They were exposed to Marxist political education. The government shaped how citizens understood history, politics, and class struggle. You could not get away from it even if you wanted to. Everything was approved by the state before it was sent out to the public. Kids in school learned ideas such as class struggle, where society was divided into classes only, workers versus capitalists. Workers were taught they had been exploited by the rich for centuries. Students were told that overthrowing the old system was necessary. The revolution was presented as the moment when workers finally gained power, even though they just got another tyrant, who was far worse, as their leader. But once again, this wasn't enough. Because communism needed to spread, leaders like Lenin believed that Soviet Russia alone could not remain socialist forever if the rest of the world stayed capitalist. This can be seen with their war against Poland in 1919. The new Soviet government actively tried to spread communist movements internationally by politics or by force. In 1919, the Bolsheviks created an international organization called the Communist International. Its purpose was to unite communist parties around the world and coordinate revolutionary strategy. That way, they could spread communism more effectively. The first chairman of this organization was Gregory Zinoviev. Zinoviev's job was to spread communist ideology internationally and guide communist parties in other countries. To do this, one of his main goals was to build new communist parties in many different countries. Under his leadership, the Comintern encouraged socialist groups to break away from moderate socialist parties and form revolutionary communist parties. Examples include the creation or strengthening of parties such as the Communist Party of Germany, French Communist Party, Communist Party of Great Britain. These parties were expected to follow the revolutionary model developed by the Bolsheviks. By creating new communist parties under his leadership, it could be better controlled and more effective, because they could have the support of the Soviet Union. At the Second Congress of the Comintern, Zinoviev helped introduce a famous set of rules, called the 21 Conditions. These rules required communist parties to support the dictatorship of the proletariat, follow instructions from the Comintern leadership, remove reformist or moderate socialist leaders, and organize revolutionary propaganda. The goal was to ensure the communist parties were disciplined, revolutionary, and loyal to the Bolshevik strategy, which meant a total revolution. Under Zinoviev, the Comintern became strongly centralized. If we look at other communist/socialist revolutions in more detail, then we can see a pattern. Most revolutions happened when the existing government was weak, unpopular, or unable to solve major problems. People felt the existing system could no longer provide stability or fairness, and they looked for an escape. Revolutionary leaders often gained support by promising land distribution, better conditions for workers, and an end to economic inequality. This can also apply to other leaders in general, but some examples are Lenin, who promised peace, land, and bread; Mao Zedong promised land for peasants in China; Fidel Castro promised social and economic reforms in Cuba. These promises helped revolutionaries gain support from peasants and workers, who are often the majority of the population. But these people were just useful idiots. Once the revolution does happen, they just end up being sacrificed to die for their leaders, who have no intention of helping them, just want to keep their power. Furthermore, the communist ideology promises heaven on earth, but earth will never be heaven, that's why it never works. Another example of communism trying to take hold was the Spanish Civil War. To understand why Spain became a hotbed of radical left-wing politics, you have to go back to the 1930s. Spain's path to liberalism and eventually revolutionary socialism was shaped by centuries of instability, a decaying empire, and a dysfunctional political system. For centuries, Spanish society was built on three rigid pillars, the first one being the monarchy. The Spanish crown had been one of the most powerful crowns in the world during the 16th and 17th century. They were rulers of a global empire stretching from America to the Philippines. But by the 19th century, the monarchy was weak, corrupt, and deeply out of touch with modern Europe. Spain went through a succession of kings, queens, and regents, with the throne changing hands repeatedly through coups and wars. Just to give you an idea, the monarchy was so unstable that between 1814 and 1931, Spain experienced 6 civil wars, armed conflicts, and 2 brief republics. The second pillar of Spanish society was the Catholic Church. The church was arguably more powerful than the government in everyday Spanish life. It owned enormous amounts of land, ran the education system almost entirely, and controlled birth and death records, and wielded moral authority over the population. The third pillar is the aristocracy, landowners, or latifundistas. Spain's land distribution was among the most unequal in Europe. In southern regions, a tiny class of aristocratic landowners owned vast estates, sometimes covering over hundreds of thousands of acres. The peasants who worked these lands lived in conditions of poverty. They were seasonal laborers. This massive, desperate peasant underclass would become the backbone of Spain's anarchist movement later in the Civil War. Now, the big change came in the early 1800s. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and installed his brother as king, Spanish patriots fought back, but in doing so, they also debated what kind of Spain they were fighting for. The result was the Constitution of 1812, one of the most progressive documents of its time, establishing a constitutional monarchy, freedom of press, and the sovereignty of the people rather than the king. In 1813, Napoleon was fighting a two-front war and needed to free up troops, so he released the Bourbon King of Spain. Upon his return, Ferdinand VII revoked the liberal constitution of 1812 and established an absolute monarchy, creating internal turmoil. For the rest of the 19th century, Spanish politics was essentially a war between liberals who wanted a constitutional government and absolutists who wanted their old order back. In 1868, the Italian anarchist Giuseppe Fanelli, a follower of the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, traveled to Spain and gave a series of passionate speeches in Madrid and Barcelona. Even though there was a language barrier, the audience got the main idea. Spanish anarchism grew into the CNT, founded in 1910, a massive anarcho-syndicalist trade union that at its peak had over 1.5 million members. The CNT believed in direct action, general strikes, and the eventual abolition of the state entirely. In 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera launched a coup with the king's blessing and ruled Spain as a dictator for 7 years. He suspended the constitution, banned political parties, and tried to modernize Spain through public works and economic development. But he couldn't win the favor of the Spanish people. His reign actually accelerated the growth of the left rather than containing it, especially after the effect of the global downturn that followed the Wall Street crash of 1929, which increased public discontent. When Primo de Rivera resigned in January 1930, he was exhausted and broken. His health was in a bad shape. The combination of an immense pressure of governing, his lifestyle, and underlying medical conditions that had taken a severe toll on him. A healthier, more energetic Primo de Rivera might have been able to manage or suppress the political opposition, as he had done earlier in his reign. But by 1929, he simply no longer had the physical or psychological strength to do so. His decision-making became more erratic. His famous confidence went into a kind of fake strongman attitude, and he became increasingly isolated. He left behind a country that had lost faith in both the old parties and the military dictatorship. The only path forward seemed to be genuine democratic reform or a revolution. By 1931, King Alfonso XIII, who had backed Primo de Rivera, was politically corrupt. Municipal elections held in April 1931 became a referendum on the monarchy itself. Republicans and socialists swept the cities in a landslide. The result was stunning. Without a single shot being fired, Alfonso XIII went into exile, and on April 14, 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed, to scenes of jubilation in cities across Spain. Crowds flooded the streets waving Republican flags, but there were still many unsolved problems in Spain, like anarchists who didn't believe in the Republic at all, socialists torn between reform and revolution, and millions of landless peasants demanding agrarian reform. The left had finally taken power, but the Spain it governed was a pressure cooker ready to explode. Almost immediately after the Republic was proclaimed in April 1931, anti-clerical violence erupted. In May 1931, mobs in Madrid, Seville, and other cities began systematically burning churches, convents, and religious schools. The scale was shocking. Over 100 religious buildings were burned in just a few days. Religious communities were driven out of their homes, and the Prime Minister, Emmanuel Azana, was widely criticized for being slow to intervene. Azana himself reportedly said he would not sacrifice a single Republican to save all the churches in Spain, a remark that caused outrage. For millions of devout Spanish Catholics, which was the majority of the population, this was not just political violence, it was an existential threat to their entire way of life. The burning of churches, more than almost any other single event, convinced conservatives in Catholic Spain that the Republic was their enemy. The Republican government pushed through a sweeping program of secularization that, for Catholics, this was a declaration of war on the Church. For example, religious orders were restricted from engaging in commerce or education, and church funding from the state was cut off. Half the country felt its deepest values were under attack. In January 1933, anarchist peasants in the tiny village of Casa Vegas in Andalusia rose up in what they believed would be the beginning of a nationwide anarchist revolution. They declared libertarian communism in their village. They cut telegram lines and attacked local civil guard posts. The government response was brutal. Assault guards surrounded the village when a small group of anarchists barricaded themselves in a hut. The guards set it on fire, burning the occupants alive. They then executed approximately 14 captured peasants outside the village. The massacre devastated the Republicans' moral authority. The left accused Azana's government of behaving like the old regime. It contributed directly to the Republic's crushing defeat in the 1933 elections, when disillusioned anarchists refused to vote and conservative parties swept to power. Another notable incident happened in October 1934 when the government invited 3 ministers from the CEDA, a Catholic conservative party, into the cabinet. The Spanish Socialist Party and its trade union, the UGT, called for an armed revolution. Their argument was that the CEDA was essentially fascist, and allowing it into the government was unacceptable, though the CEDA had actually won its seat democratically. The uprising failed almost everywhere in Spain, but not in Asturias. In the coal mining regions of Asturias in northern Spain, roughly 30,000 armed miners launched a genuine revolution. They seized control of the entire region. They also attacked and killed over 30 priests and monks, and bombed the University of Oviedo, destroying its historic library. The government crushed the uprising by sending in the Spanish Foreign Legion and Moroccan troops, commanded by a young general named Francisco Franco. The repression was savage. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 miners were killed, and up to 30,000 were imprisoned. The October 1934 uprisings had unforeseen consequences, such as it taught the Spanish right that the left would use armed conflict the moment they disliked an election result. It also permanently poisoned relations between the left and right. Both sides now believed that the other was an existential threat to each other. The socialist leader, Francisco Largo Caballero, who helped plan the uprising, began calling himself, quote, the Spanish Lenin, end quote, and openly spoke of establishing a socialist dictatorship, which made the political atmosphere even worse. Furthermore, during this time we can see how the Republican government handled the law. When right-wing groups engaged in public protests, demonstrations, or even minor provocations, the government responded swiftly and forcefully, suspending newspapers, arresting leaders, closing operations, and invoking emergency powers. But when the left-wing anarchist groups engaged in far more serious acts of violence, including insurrections, church burnings, and attacks on property, the government's response was considerably more hesitant, slower, and more lenient. An example we can see is the aftermath of the October 1934 revolution. The government gave a general amnesty for all those convicted or awaiting trial for their participation in the October 1934 insurrection. Men convicted of armed rebellion against the constitutional government were freed and restored to full political activity within days. Largo Caballero, who had openly called for a socialist revolution and whose party had organized the insurrection, returned to public life as a celebrated figure. So the law was not applied equally, which gave more fuel to the fire that was about to explode. But it was only going to get worse. Between February and July, waves of political violence escalated during these months. Assassinations, beatings, and attacks on police offices in which perpetrators from the left enjoyed near total impunity, while right-wing violence was persecuted more vigorously. Socialist and communist youth movements could engage in open intimidation with little fear of legal consequences. In Andalusia, organized land seizures by socialist and anarchist peasants took place on a massive scale. In the spring of 1936, the government largely tolerated these illegal seizures rather than enforcing the law. Partly out of political sympathy and partly out of fear of confronting its own base, the IRA was a body established to oversee the legal redistribution of land. When land was expropriated legally, the intention was that the peasants, collectives, or individual families would be settled on the land as tenants or smallholders. They would receive some minimum support in the form of tools, seeds, and credit, and the former owners would receive compensation. Though this was contested and often inadequate, but the IRA was underfunded and understaffed, riddled with bureaucratic obstacles, and they moved at a slow pace. The gap between the enormous expectations the Republic had raised among the rural population and the actual result of the legal reform created a pressure cooker situation that made illegal seizures increasingly attractive. There were 2 waves of these land seizures, the first one being in 1932, and the far more dramatic and extensive wave in the spring and summer of 1936. In practical terms, a seizure typically unfolded in a fairly consistent pattern. Local branches of the Socialist Land Worker Union or Anarchist Agricultural Organization would organize groups of landless laborers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. They would march onto an estate, sometimes in the early morning, and simply begin working the land, declaring it occupied. Local civil guard units were often too small, too isolated, or simply unwilling to confront the large organized groups of determined men. The landowner was effectively expelled from management of his own property, sometimes physically driven off. The timing of the 1936 seizures was catastrophic in many cases. Estates were seized in the middle of the growing season, in spring and early summer, disrupting cultivation at critical moments. Crops that needed tending were neglected during the confusion of the takeover. The seized property often lacked the capital infrastructure to continue functioning, without the organizational and financial resources the landowner had provided, such as irrigation maintenance, equipment, access to credit, relations with buyers and merchants. The collectives that replaced the landowners frequently had none of these things and no way to quickly acquire them, so the farms were no longer making crops. Livestock on many estates suffered badly. Animals were sometimes slaughtered immediately for food, rather than maintained as productive capital. Draft animals were particularly important, and their loss set back cultivation seriously. The seeds and tools available at the point of seizure were not always sufficient for the scale of farming being attempted, and the new communists had no credit history or financial resources to get more. The large estates, regardless of their social morality, had been run by professional administrators with agricultural expertise. They had knowledge of specific land, established relations with markets, and access to networks. When these people were expelled, they were replaced by collective committees, which were composed of men who had extensive experience as laborers but very little as managers or soil management. This management vacuum is one of the consistent weaknesses of the collective farming experiments, and the output on many seized estates dropped significantly in the first seasons. Some large aristocratic landowners simply left for the cities or abroad, having enough financial resources and social connections to absorb the loss. They were not willing to fight it out with the leftists and die on that hill. But many medium landowners were in a more precarious position. A family farm which had several hundreds of acres might have their entire livelihood and capital tied up in that land. Seizure could mean genuine ruin, and these groups were particularly radicalized by the experience, pushing them toward active support for the military security. Now came the event of the elections in 1936. To understand what happened, we need to know how the electoral system even worked. Spain used a modified majority system. The key features were each province returned multiple deputies. Voters cast ballots for coalition slates rather than individual candidates. The coalition winning a majority of the votes in a province received approximately 80% of that province's seat, with the remaining 20% going to the second place coalition. This system was designed to produce stable parliamentary majorities, but it meant that a relatively small advantage in a raw vote could translate into an enormous advantage in seats. The Popular Front won the election by a margin in raw votes that was genuinely quite narrow. Other historians calculate the margin as somewhere between 150,000 and perhaps 250,000 votes out of approximately 9.5 million votes cast. This was a real but modest polarity of the popular vote, somewhere in the range of perhaps 1 to 2% points separating the Popular Front from the National Front, coalition of the right. But through the mechanics of the electoral system, this narrow popular vote advantage translated into a massive majority. The Popular Front ended with around 263 seats against the right's approximately 156, with the center holding the balance. This gross disproportional between vote share and seat share created a parliament that drastically overstated the Popular Front's actual support in the country and understated their rights. From the very beginning, the parliamentary arithmetic gave a misleading picture of where the Spanish opinion actually stood. But something interesting happened immediately after the polls closed on February 16th. The transition of power was itself conducted in a manner that was constitutionally questionable and politically intimidating. The outgoing center-right government of Portela Valladares had the constitutional responsibility to oversee the completion of the vote count and the transfer of power once results were certified. The full counting and the certification of results took several days, and there were provinces where results remained genuinely uncertain in the immediate aftermath of voting. Before results were officially certified, massive popular celebrations and demonstrations erupted in cities and towns across Spain, with socialist and anarchist workers effectively taking to the streets. Local authorities in many areas, such as civil governors, municipal councils, were effectively displaced or forced to resign by popular pressure before any legal transfer of power had occurred. Even worse, prisoners were released from jails across Spain by popular action. Crowds simply broke open prisons and freed political prisoners before any amnesty had been legally enacted. This happened on a massive scale, and the authorities did nothing to stop it. The outgoing Prime Minister, Portela Valladares, faced with this wave of popular pressure, and apparently in a state of considerable fear, resigned prematurely and handed power to Azana before the official results were even fully certified. The Credential Committee reviewed a large number of disputed seats and made changes to the results in a way that consistently favored the Popular Front. annulled results in several provinces where the right had won or where results were contested, ordering new elections or simply reassigning seats. Invalidated votes cast for right-wing candidates on a various technical pretexts, while being far more lenient about equivalent irregularities in Popular Front results. Changes were made affecting dozens of seats, enough to have a meaningful impact on the parliamentary balance, even starting from the already distorted baseline created by the electoral system. An example of outright manipulation was in two provinces, Granada and Cuenca. In Granada, the right-wing coalition had won the election results as counted. The Credentials Committee annulled these results entirely, citing violence and irregularities, some of which were real, but the committee applied a standard it did not apply to the Popular Front victories in provinces where equivalent or worse irregularities had favored the left. New elections were ordered, but they were held in an atmosphere of such extreme intimidation and political violence that the right effectively could not campaign. The Popular Front won the new elections and took the Granada seats. In Cuenca, there was a similar annulment process, with particularly significance, with one of the seats eventually awarded to the Popular Front. Cuenca involves significant manipulation of results that directly changed the outcome. The Cuenca case is notable because the right had strong evidence of having won legitimately, and the annulment was particularly difficult to justify on neutral legal grounds. The wave of violence that followed the election in the weeks before the new government was fully established. This violence involved attacks on right-wing offices and newspapers, physical assaults on conservative politicians and activists. This created an atmosphere in which many right-wing local officials and candidates were simply too frightened to contest irregularities. More legal challenges to dispute results had to be pursued in an atmosphere of physical threat, which made people less inclined to dispute them. The Credentials Committee operated under the implicit pressure of knowing that unfavorable decisions toward the Popular Front could provoke violent reactions. People saw how violent the left could be in previous years and didn't want that to happen again. People were deeply divided along the lines of left and right. This disjunction between the actual state of Spanish opinion closely divided the behavior of a government that acted as if it represented an overwhelming national majority, which it didn't. This civil war would be a foreshadowing event that would later show itself in the future on the world stage. After the election results, Emmanuel Azana, the dominant left-wing politician, was appointed prime minister. But in May 1936, he allowed himself to be elevated to the presidency, vacating the prime ministership. By accepting the presidency, he removed himself from effective executive power at precisely the moment when a strong leadership was most needed. The prime minister who replaced him was Santiago Quiroga, a man who was politically weak, physically ill, and wholly inadequate to the situation he faced. Quiroga ruled over the accelerating breakdown of the public order in the spring and early summer of 36, with a mixture of denial and paralysis. And then the collapse of normal civic order happened in the months between the election and the military uprising. Hundreds of political assassinations between February and July, with perpetrators from both left and right, but with the left enjoying far more greater impunity, and regular armed clashes between socialist and anarchist militias and Falangist and Carlist groups. By 1936, the situation had reached a dramatic changing point. The overthrow that would become the July Uprising was organized primarily by General Emilio Mola, operating from his position in Pamplona. This included groups like Falangist, Carlist, and Monarchist. By the mid-36, there was a significant number of officers, political figures who had generally supported the Republic, but were now joining or quietly sympathizing with the coup, convinced that the Republic as it was actually functioning had become incapable with basic legal order and their own physical safety. Even some moderate socialists like Prieto privately recognized by this point the situation was heading towards total collapse. Another big event that would come was in July 13, 1936, in the final days before the uprising. Calvo Sotelo was a leading right-wing parliamentary opposition figure, a monarchist and authoritarian conservative who was the most effective parliamentary critic of the Popular Front government. He was arrested by the officers of the Assault Guard, which was the Republican security force, and taken to their headquarters. He was shot in the back of the head, and his body dumped at a Madrid cemetery. The men who killed him were acting in retaliation for their earlier Falangist assassination of a left-wing Assault Guard officer, Lieutenant Castillo. The government's response was inadequate and evasive, failing to pursue justice with anything like the vigor it would have applied had a right-wing group murdered a prominent left-wing politician. The message it sent to the right was clear, that even parliamentary immunity and prominent public status offered no protection, and that elements of the state security apparatus were operating as partisan assassins. The military uprising began on July 17th in Spanish Morocco and spread to mainland Spain the next day. The coup half succeeded and half failed, and this turned what might have been either a successful coup or a quickly crushed rebellion into a prolonged and devastating civil war. In Spanish Morocco, the Army of Africa, which was led under Franco, quickly secured complete control. In Navarre and Old Castile, the uprising succeeded, with enthusiastic Carlist and conservative support. In Seville, General Queipo de Llano seized control in one of the war's most remarkable episodes of personal success, securing a major southern city with minimal forces. But in Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, the Basque Country, and other major centers, the uprising failed. The Republic retained control of the largest cities, most of the industrial base, the gold reserves, and the majority of Spain's population. General Sonuriu, who was supposed to lead the uprising as its senior figure, was killed in a plane crash on July 20th, trying to fly from Portugal to Spain, removing the coup's designated political leader at its most critical moment. The Soviet intervention was the single most important foreign contributor to the Republican war effort, and also the most politically damning to the Republicans' internal coherence and international standing. Unlike the Soviets, the Republicans were not the right type of communist. They had liberal Republicans, socialists, anarchists, and Trotsky-leaning communists, rather than a unified Stalinist party. Stalin wanted a disciplined Moscow-aligned communist movement. The Republic's left was too polaristic and independent for his taste. Stalin's decision to intervene was driven by several overlapping factors. Some of the factions inside the Popular Front government was the kind the commentator had been promoting since 1935, like the Communist Party of Spain. Allowing it to be crushed would be a major ideological setback. For Stalin, Spain offered an opportunity to bleed Germany and Italy at a relatively low cost to the Soviet Union, keeping these powers occupied in a costly conflict. The Soviet military assistance to the Republic was crucial and arrived at a critical moment in the autumn of '36 when Franco's Army of Africa was advancing on Madrid, and the Republic seemed on the verge of immediate collapse. But the Soviet tanks, primarily T-26, arrived in significant numbers and were decisive in stopping Franco's advance on Madrid in November of '36. The Soviets also gave aircraft, which gave the Republic a temporary air superiority in late 1936, and were crucial in the defense of Madrid. Soviet NKVD officers arrived alongside the military advisors and began building an intelligence and security apparatus within Republican Spain that would have profound and sinister consequences. The Republicans possessed the fourth largest gold reserve in the world, approximately 510 tons of gold held in the Bank of Spain. In one of the most important decisions of the entire war, Prime Minister Largo Caballero authorized the shipment of the entire Spanish gold reserve to Moscow in October to pay for Soviet arms and to keep it safe from Franco. The gold never returned, and the Soviets' accounting of what the gold paid for was unclear, and the Republicans never received a proper accounting of what it had supposedly purchased. Once the gold was gone, the Republic was entirely financially dependent on the Soviet goodwill. It basically became a puppet state that Moscow could cut off at any point. The arms supply that the Republic needed to survive, giving Stalin enormous political leverage over the Republican government. The Spanish Communist Party, or the PCE, had been a small, marginal party before the war, around 30,000 members in February. By late 1936 and through 1937, it had grown dramatically because it controlled or had access to Soviet arms, giving it enormous power. Units that affiliated with the communists got weapons. Those that didn't often went without. It attracted the middle classes and moderate Republicans with its tactical line of subordinating revolution to winning the war, presenting itself as the responsible, order-maintaining force against anarchist chaos, a deeply ironic position given its actual agenda. The new officer corps of the new Popular Army was being built from the Republican militias, which was heavily penetrated by communist officers, with NKVD advisors effectively controlling key positions. In May 1937, fighting broke out in Barcelona between anarchist and POUM forces on one side and communist Republican forces on the other. Triggered by a government attempt to take control of the Barcelona telephone exchange from the anarchist CNT, the fighting revealed the depth of the political fractures within the Republican coalition. The communists used this crisis to crush the POUM, accusing its leaders of being Trotskyist agents of Franco, which was false. They just used this as an excuse to get rid of them. The POUM's leader was abducted by NKVD agents, tortured, and murdered on Spanish Republican territory by Soviet secret police, killing a man who had devoted his life to the left. The Barcelona events and the POUM suppression destroyed Largo's government, replacing it with a more communist, accommodating government of Juan Negrin. Unlike the Bolsheviks, the Republicans were deeply divided and had no central leader they followed. It was a lot of different factions working together to defeat a common enemy. But at the same time, they wanted to stab the other faction in the back and take control of the government. This was similar to what happened to the white forces in the Russian Civil War, but this time it was the other side that was disorganized. But on the nationalist side, they were much more unified under Franco. While they still had different factions that wanted power, it was not as bad as the Republicans. But Franco also had help from foreign countries like Italy and Germany. Hitler's decision to intervene on Franco's behalf was made quickly in late July, following a personal appeal from Franco himself. Spain and Spanish Morocco offered access to iron ore, copper, and other minerals vital to German rearmament. A friendly Spain could economically help the Reich. Spain also offered an opportunity to test new weapons and tactics under combat conditions, an opportunity the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe used extensively. Hitler also genuinely regarded the Spanish conflict as part of a broader struggle against Bolshevism. The centerpiece of German military intervention was the Condor Legion, an expeditionary force of aircraft, tanks, artillery, and supporting personnel that rotated through Spain throughout the war, giving thousands of German military personnel combat experience while developing new equipment. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters eventually established air superiority over the Republican Air Force for most of the war. Its Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft had performed the crucial early task of airlifting Franco's Army of Africa from Morocco to mainland Spain in August 1936. Without this airlift, the uprising might have collapsed within its first weeks. Germany also provided financial and economical support to the nationalist side and helped break the Republicans' attempt to purchase arms on the international market. But the Italian intervention was actually larger in scale than the German one, in terms of total manpower committed. Though the German contribution was more effective in technology and more decisive militarily, a friendly Spain could dramatically strengthen Italy's strategic position in the Western Mediterranean, potentially threatening French communications with North Africa. Mussolini partly wanted an Italian rather than a German sphere of influence in Spain. This created a degree of competitive tension between the two powers, even though they both supported Franco. Italy sent approximately 70 to 80,000 military personnel over the course of the war. The Italian military performance was mixed. The CTV suffered a notable defeat at the Battle of Guadalajara in March 1937 when Republican forces, including Italian anti-fascist volunteers fighting on the other side, routed Italian nationalist columns in conditions of bad weather and poor coordination. Guadalajara was a significant embarrassment for Mussolini that temporarily cooled his enthusiasm for the Spanish adventure. The British policy was to provide Franco with a degree of international protection. Britain made it clear it would not tolerate Italian or German military occupation of Spanish territory or ports. But France was different. The Popular Front government of Leon Blum that came to power in France in June 1936 was ideologically sympathetic to the Spanish Republic and came under enormous pressure from French leftists and socialists to intervene on the Republican side. Blum personally wanted to help the Republic, but faced constraints from Britain, which made it clear it would not support France if French intervention in Spain led to a confrontation with Germany and Italy. There were genuine fears that open French intervention could escalate into a general European war that France was not in a position to win. Blum ultimately adopted a policy of covert and semi-covert assistance, allowing some armed and volunteers to cross into Spain while maintaining the cover of non-intervention. There were also some international brigades, which was the volunteer force recruited by the Comintern, from left-wing activists across Europe and the America to fight for the Republic. Approximately 35,000 volunteers from over 50 countries served in the International Brigade, but they were organized, led, and politically controlled by the Comintern and the PCE. Volunteers who expressed doubts, criticized Soviet policy, or were suspected of Trotskyist sympathies faced imprisonment or worse at the hands of the same NKVD apparatus operating within Republican Spain. But how did the Civil War actually play out? Franco's military strategy is one of the most interesting, in some respects controversial aspects of his military history. Franco operated with a strategic concept that was simultaneously military sound in some respects and deliberately prolonged in others. Franco prioritized territorial consolidation and the destruction of enemy forces over rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. When his forces took ground, he typically paused to secure it, eliminate Republican resistance, and establish firm administrative control before advancing further. Critics, including some of his German and Italian advisors, repeatedly argued he should move faster and exploit successes more aggressively. Franco consistently refused. It is important to know that Franco never once retreated during the war. This attitude came from his experience in Morocco, where overextension could be fatal. The war needed to achieve not just territorial conquest, but the complete destruction of the left as an organized political force. Once on the mainland, the Army of Africa, the Regulars, which were Moroccan troops, and the Foreign Legion were superior to anything the Republic could initially put against them. They were professional soldiers with combat experience, high morale, and aggressive offensive tactics. Franco and his Army of Africa commanders employed combined arms tactics considerably more effective than the Republicans for most of the war. The integration of infantry, artillery, armor, and air support gave the Nationalists a consistent tactical advantage at the operational level. The first major campaign of the war was the march of the Army of Africa north from Andalusia toward Madrid. The Nationalist troops under General Yagüe covered hundreds of miles in weeks, sweeping aside the Republicans' militia forces with ease. In September 1936, Franco made a decision to save an important city, the Alcazar of Toledo, a fortress held by a Nationalist garrison under Colonel Moscardo. Since the war's beginning, this was besieged by Republican forces. It had become an enormous propaganda symbol for both sides. Franco diverted his advance on Madrid to relieve the Alcazar first. German and Italian advisors were furious, arguing this delay cost the Nationalists a chance to take Madrid before the city could be properly defended and before Soviet arms and the international brigades arrived. The propaganda and morale value for Franco relieving the Alcazar outweighed the calculation of military speed on Madrid. Whether this was a strategic error or a sound political judgment is something that is left for the viewer to decide. But we must wonder, could the war have ended sooner if Franco went straight for Madrid? Let me know what you think in the comments. Another problem with the Republican military was units elected their own officers and voted on orders they disagreed with, and refused to accept military discipline. They were unprepared for the shock of contact with the professional Moroccan troops and foreign legionaries, whose tactical aggression and energy shattered the enemy's cohesion repeatedly. An example of this is the city of Badajoz, where nationalist forces captured the city and conducted a mass killing of prisoners and suspected leftists. This is an example of the brutal tactics employed by Yagüe's troops, which served both to eliminate potential resistance and to spread fear that paralyzed Republican defenders ahead of the advancing troops. The defense of Madrid in November is treated as one of the most dramatic and military significant in the entire war. The nationalist troops reached the outskirts of Madrid and launched their assault, expecting the city to fall quickly. Instead, they encountered resistance. The arrival of Soviet tanks made the offensive much harder. At the time, the Soviet tanks were much better than anything the Nationalists had on their side. Franco's assault on Madrid failed. After weeks of brutal fighting in the university city and districts, the front stabilized, and Franco essentially accepted that Madrid could not be taken by direct assault. He shifted to attempt to cut it off through flanking operations and encircle it. Franco attempted to cut the Madrid-Valencia road, Madrid's main supply line leading into the city, by advancing across the Jarama River south of Madrid. The Battle of Jarama, as one of the war's bloodiest engagements, the Nationalists pushed across the river, but were stopped short of the road. The international brigades like the British Battalion and the American Abraham Lincoln Battalion suffered catastrophic casualties in fighting at Suicide Hill. Both sides effectively fought each other to exhaustion, with neither achieving their actual objectives. The front stabilized and remained unchanged. Jarama demonstrated the Republic had developed sufficient military capacity to deny the Nationalists easy victory while showing the Nationalists still had enough offensive power to make any Republican position dangerous. While Jarama was still grinding on, the Italians launched their own flanking attempt toward Madrid from the northeast. The Battle of Guadalajara. The Italian CTV advancing along the main road encountered extremely bad weather, rain, snow, and mud that immobilized motorized divisions. There were also unexpected Republican resistance, including Soviet aircraft that achieved temporary air superiority. The Italian divisions were routed and driven back with significant losses. This was a genuine Republican military victory, but also notes its limitation. It stopped one offensive without fundamentally changing the strategic situation around Madrid. With Madrid successfully defended and the encirclement attempt failed, Franco now had to make a crucial decision in the spring of 37. To abandon the direct assault on Madrid and instead tour north to conquer the Basque Country, Santander, and Asturias. The northern Republican zone was geographically isolated from the rest of Republic Spain. Separated by the nationalist-controlled territory of Old Castile, it contained vital industrial resources such as Basque steel production and Austrian coal mines that the Republic needed desperately. Conquering the north would free up forces currently pinned down facing the isolated northern front for use elsewhere. The northern terrain, while difficult, was more favorable to the systematic infantry and artillery warfare at which the Nationalists excelled at than the open central plateau around Madrid. The Condor Legion, along with Italian aircraft, bombed the Basque town of Guernica on Market Day, killing several hundred civilians. The exact number has been disputed by historians. Guernica had legitimate military significance as a road junction and was not purely a civilian target, but the bombing was conducted in a manner that made civilian casualties inevitable and enormous. The political consequences of Guernica was more significant than its immediate military effect. It became the defining international image of nationalist brutality, permanently damaging the nationalist legitimacy abroad. The Basque campaign proceeded through spring and early summer of 37. The Ring of Iron was a fortified defensive line around Bilbao that Basque engineers had constructed. Before the campaign began, when a Basque military engineer defected to the nationalists with his plans, the nationalists had systematically progressed against Basque forces that were mainly outclassed and suffering from the Republic's inability to provide air or material support to the isolated northern zone. Bilbao fell on June 19th, a major nationalist victory that gave them the Basque industrial base. Sandor and Asturias followed in October, completing the conquest of the north. While Franco was conquering the north, the Republican Army was reorganizing its leaders. The key figure in Republican military organization was General Vicente Rojo, the Republic's most capable military mind. Rojo understood that the militia system was militarily unworkable and pushed systematically for centralized command, replacing the autonomous militias and introducing professional military discipline by replacing the ideological-driven democratic decision-making of the earlier militias. The Popular Army Rojo helped create by 37 was a considerably more formidable force than the militias of 36, but there were still problems that Rojo could never fully overcome, such as political interference in the military from communist pressure for political reliable commanders, regardless of military ability, constantly distorted command decisions. Rojo's authority was constantly undermined by politics, party organizations, and competing governmental authorities. Rojo developed a concept of divisionary offensive operations, designed to relieve pressure on threatened fronts by forcing the nationalists to divert forces to meet attacks elsewhere. This produced several of the war's Republican offensive operations. While Franco was away completing his conquest of the Basque Country, the Republic launched its first major operation during the Battle of Brunet, west of Madrid, in July 37. We will see how the Republicans will operate with this new military structure. Rojo designed an ambitious operation. A large Republican force would break through the relatively thin nationalist line west of Madrid. He would then exploit the breakthrough to threaten the rear of the nationalist forces besieging Madrid from the west. Ideally, Franco would divert forces from the northern campaign to deal with this crisis around Madrid. Now here's what actually happened. The initial attack achieved significant surprise and broke through the nationalist lines, capturing the town of Brunte. The Popular Army had demonstrated it could mount a serious offensive, but then the pattern of Republican offensive failure set in. The advance slowed and stopped as units outran the supply lines, lost coordination, and encountered stiffening resistance. Franco responded with a methodical counter-organization. Rather than panicking, he began shifting forces from the north and organizing a systematic counterattack. The nationalists recaptured most of the lost ground, including the town itself. In brutal fighting in intense summer heat, both sides suffered enormous casualties. The operation achieved its limited goal of temporarily slowing the northern campaign, but failed to reverse the strategic situation. Almost simultaneously with this battle, the Republic launched another offensive in Aragon aimed at the city of Zaragoza. The town of Belchite was surrounded and captured after brutal street fighting, but the main objective, Zaragoza, remained out of reach. The nationalist lines bent but did not break. The Republic expended significant forces and material for limited territorial gain. The Popular Army could mount impressive local offensive and capture objectives, but consistently failed to achieve the operational depth needed to truly threaten the nationalist position. This was partially a material problem, partially a command problem, and partially a reflection of nationalists' increasing ability to manage defensive crisis. The Battle of Teruel was the only significant city the Republic captured from the nationalists during the entire war, and then lost in the fighting of the counterattack. Rojo planned and executed a surprise winter offensive against the city. The offensive began in December of 37 in the harshest winter conditions, with temperatures dropping to extreme lows. The surprise was complete. Republic forces encircled the city before Franco could respond, and after weeks of brutal urban fighting, the nationalist garrison surrendered in January, the only case in the war where an entire nationalist force in the city was compelled to surrender. Franco's response to the loss of Teruel reveals his clever strategic thinking. Franco prioritized retaking Teruel over the strategic options, including a potential, more decisive offensive elsewhere. He committed enormous forces to the reconquest in terrible winter conditions, rather than accepting the loss and seeking compensation elsewhere. After weeks of grinding, attritional fighting, and brutal cold, the nationalists recaptured Teruel in February of 38. The Republican forces that had taken the city were shattered. The Republic suffered approximately 60,000 casualties in the campaign, including much of its best offensive capabilities. The Republic had committed and largely destroyed its main offensive reserves in a battle that ultimately gained nothing, while Franco's forces, though also badly battered, retained significant strength for the massive offensive that followed. Following the reconquest of Tyrol, Franco launched a brilliant campaign of the war, the Great Aragon Offensive of March in 38, that drove all the way to the Mediterranean coast, cutting Republican Spain in two. This operation was on a completely different scale from anything previously attempted in the war. A massive concentration of infantry, artillery, and armor along a wide front in Aragon. Condor Legion aircraft providing close air support on a scale that overwhelmed Republican air defenses. The Italian CTV contributing significant armed and infantry forces. The attack achieved complete operational surprise despite its scale. The Republican lines in Aragon simply dissolved under the weight of the nationalist assault. The Republican army of the East in Aragon had been weakened by the transfer of units to Tyrol and never been rebuilt to full strength. The anarchist collectives of Aragon had been surprised by communist-backed Republican forces in 37, devastating morale and organization capacity in the region. The sheer weight and coordination of the nationalist attack overwhelmed defensive units. Nationalist columns advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, capturing Bolsheviks, Caps, and reaching the Mediterranean coast at Vinaròs on April 15, 1938. Republican Spain was now cut in two, Catalonia separated from the central and southern Republican zone. This was the moment the war was effectively decided militarily, although the conflict continued for another year. After the Aragon offensive, the Republic had no realistic path to military victory. The question from this point was only how long the end would be postponed. Despite their failure to stop the Aragon offensive, the Republic made one final supreme military effort, the Battle of Ebro, the largest single battle of the Civil War. Rojo conceived a massive surprise crossing the Ebro River aimed at relieving pressure on Valencia, which Franco was threatening from the south, reconnecting Catalonia with Central Republican zone if possible. On the night of July 24, 1938, Republican forces crossed the Ebro in boats in a surprise operation. They achieved complete tactical surprise within days and had established a large bridgehead on the nationalist side of the river, advancing and capturing thousands of prisoners. Once Franco got the news of this offensive, he refused to panic or commit his reserve forces to a hasty counterattack. Instead, he made the cold-blooded strategic decision to fight the battle of attrition on the Ebro bridgehead to systematically destroy the Republic's last major military force in place rather than drive them back across the river quickly. He committed enormous air, artillery, and infantry resources, not to a swift reconquest, but to a grinding, methodical advance that compressed the bridgehead slowly while destroying Republican units. The battle lasted for 4 months, from July to November. When the Nationalists finally drove the Republicans back across the Ebro in November 38, the Popular Army had been strategically gutted. It had no more major offensive capacity and insufficient defense strength to resist the Catalan offensive that followed. Franco launched the Catalan offensive in December of 38. Given the Republic's shattered state, the nationalist advance was rapid and largely irresistible. By this point, the war was pretty much won by the nationalist forces. Barcelona fell on January 26 of 39, with minimal resistance. The population was exhausted, demoralized, in many cases simply happy the fighting was ending. Hundreds of thousands of Republican soldiers and civilians fled across the French border once they saw the writing on the wall that they were going to lose. Even after the fall of Catalonia, the Republic still held Madrid, Valencia, and a significant portion of central and southern eastern Spain. In March 1939, Colonel Casado, the commander of the Republican Army of the Center in Madrid, launched a coup against the Negrin government with support from the socialist Bastero and various military commanders. His stated justification was that the current government's continued resistance was pointless and was only prolonging suffering to serve communist political interests. Fighting between Casado's forces and communist units in Madrid killed several thousands of people in the war's final week. Madrid fell on March 28, 1939. The last Republican holdouts surrendered on April 1st, the date which Franco declared the war officially over and won. Unlike the Republicans, the nationalist forces, whatever its political character, maintained a far greater unity of purpose and command, which would prevail after the war. The reaction of the Comintern after defeat was actually much earlier. Stalin had already effectively abandoned the Republic well before Franco's final victory. The Soviet arms shipment to the Republic slowed dramatically in 38 and effectively ceased before the final Catalonian campaign. The Republic was left to face Franco's final offensive with dwindling ammunition, replacement parts, and aircraft, all while still technically depending on Soviet goodwill, with its gold reserves already spent in Moscow. They basically had no money, and ironically, one of the ideas in communism is eradication of money. So it looks like they achieved their goal in that regard. When Franco's victory became undeniable in early 39, the official Soviet response was characterized by ideological embarrassment and rapid political repositioning. Publicly, the Soviet Union maintained that faction that it had done everything possible to save the Spanish Republic, and that its defeat was the result of Western capitalists, who were supposed to be the Comintern's greatest enemy. But it seems in this situation they were not, and they were being blamed for not helping them against their fight with the nationalists. The Comintern's propaganda apparatus produced a narrative in which the defeat was blamed entirely on British and French non-intervention and the betrayal of the Western democracies. Any suggestion that Soviet policy had contributed to the Republic's defeat, like the NKVD terror within Republican Spain, the communist political takeover that destroyed internal unity, or the eventual reduction of arms supply, was simply not acknowledged and was brutally suppressed. A dark moment in this story is what happened to the Spanish communist and Republican officials who fled to the Soviet Union after the war's end. This is where the Soviet reaction becomes more honest about the regime's true nature. Hundreds of Spanish Communist Party members, International Brigade veterans, Soviet military advisors who had served in Spain, and NKVD officers who had operated there became caught up in Stalin's purges. The men who had served in Spain had been exposed to foreign influences and foreign contacts. In Stalin's paranoid worldview, this made them automatically suspicious. The defeat in Spain needed someone to blame, and the men who had been there were convenient scapegoats. They could be accused of sabotage, Trotskyism, or working with foreign intelligence services. Many Soviet military advisors who had served in Spain and returned home were arrested, tried in secret, shot, or sent to the Gulag. An example of this is General Yan Berzin, who was a chief Soviet military advisor in Spain. He was recalled to Moscow and executed. Vladimir Groziev, another senior advisor who was also killed. Numerous NKVD officers who had operated in Spain met the same fate. The men Stalin had sent to fight for the Republic were murdered by the regime they had served. Spanish communist leaders who had taken refuge in Moscow found themselves in an extraordinary precarious position, dependent on Soviet hospitality, unable to return home, and aware that any deviation from the current Stalinist line could be fatal. The Spanish Communist Party in exile became one of the most Stalinist of all European communist parties, partly because its leadership in Moscow was dependent on maintaining Stalin's approval to survive. Now that the conflict ended, Franco needed to secure power and end any resistance. Franco's government carried out an extensive program of executions of recaptured Republican military personnel, political leaders, officials, and activists in the months and years following the war's end. The numbers are still debated by historians, but approximately 50,000 people were executed by Franco's government after the war ended. This was carried out through military tribunals that operated with procedures and predetermined outcomes in the great majority of cases. After the Civil War ended, it marked a time for Spain to rebuild. Many buildings, infrastructure was destroyed. Families were torn apart along sides of left and right. Ultimately, around 500,000 to over 1 million people, including combatants and civilians, died during the Civil War. Now Franco had the task to rebuild Spain from the ashes of the war. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about these two civil wars in the comments below. If you enjoyed this type of content, subscribe for future videos.